Welcome to the Energy Forum, a podcast from the Center for Energy Studies at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. I'm Ken Medlock, Senior Director of the Center for Energy Studies. In today's episode, we're focusing on the evolution of electricity markets in Texas and the importance of natural disaster resilience. We don't always connect these two things in general conversations about electricity, but as we have seen on multiple occasions over the last few years, they are deeply intertwined. In this conversation, we'll explore some of the challenges we face in keeping our lights on. Then we'll turn to a new tool developed here at CES, a public dashboard that maps 75 years of natural disaster exposure alongside urban growth, demographic trends, and today's energy infrastructure. It's a first-of-its-kind visualization that brings data to life and helps us understand how disaster risk and infrastructure planning intersect. Joining me is Julie Cohn, a research historian and non-resident scholar here at CES, and Miaomiao Rimmer, a research manager at CES and chief architect of the new dashboard. Let's get started. In Texas, electricity demand has been growing rapidly, and projected population increases, data center expansion, electrification of transportation, and general industrial growth are placing pressures on the electrical system. At the same time, tropical storms, hurricanes, and other extreme weather events have tested the resilience of critical systems, exposing vulnerabilities in generation and transmission, many of which are actively being addressed by market participants and regulators. Julie, to start, please share with everyone the various issues you have been exploring.
Thank you, Ken. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to talk about these compelling topics. Well, as a historian, of course, my primary job is to look backwards, and one of the big projects I've been involved with recently is an oral history project where we're collecting the stories of engineers whose job was to keep the grid operating without blackouts during the 20th century, the latter years of the 20th century. They have been sharing their reflections on the work they did to keep the grid working, and also what's happening today and the kind of work that they anticipate engineers need to address in the future to keep the grid working. And I'll circle back to that in a moment. A second project has to do with what is happening today. And as some of you may know, the grid is evolving. We have new technologies for generation, for transmission, for electric vehicles, for how homes and offices and businesses are connected to the grid, and that's changing the way the grid has to be operated. So in the past, engineers dealt with giant spinning turbines that created certain types of physics on the grid, and they exploited those physics to keep everything in balance. As the listeners may remember, in order to have a working power system, you have to provide exactly the right amount of electricity at the very moment everybody is flipping their switch to use it. And this is called keeping the grid in balance. And if you have the right physics, you can get signals from the grid to do that. Today, we have all kinds of new types of generation on the grid, like solar panels, which are not spinning and not creating the same kind of physics that the engineers exploited in the past. And these generating facilities connect to the grid in a different way using power electronics. These are programmed to do certain kinds of things, which I won't spend time describing, but we'll all understand that they can be programmed in a number of different ways. And depending on how they're programmed, they will either support or undermine the stability of the grid. This is a very pressing issue right this moment today. And one of the other projects I'm working on is with a group of engineers, regulators, and so forth, who spend their time trying to understand the best possible way to program those power electronics to keep the grid stable, reliable, and efficient. And the third project is actually looking far ahead. It's a reliability initiative funded by the Department of Energy, and it involves a group of people who are trying to understand what are the challenges today that we face today, what are the challenges tomorrow, and what are the changes we'll need both in policy and technology to ensure that the grid will be reliable long into the future. As a historian, I'm providing the look back, but as a participant, I get to participate in the conversations about what's happening now and what might happen in the future.
So that's all really fascinating. You referenced inverter technology in particular with regard to the expansion of solar, and we saw some of the difficulties that engineers have been discussing for well over a decade with the expansion of this technology, but we saw some of that arise with what happened with the Iberian Peninsula blackouts recently. I wonder if you could sort of lean into Texas a little bit and sort of think about how the expansion of wind, the expansion of solar is intersecting the Texas grid, and what sort of challenges we might face going forward as we think about what we deal with here with regard to just demand growth and, expansion of generation capacity in all different types of forms, new technologies, but also the resilience issues that are so critical with regard to hurricanes, tropical storms, the derecho of last year. I mean, all these things that are, very, very much on people's minds.
Well, Texas is a really interesting situation because within our state, we have an isolated grid that provides electricity to about 90% of the customers across the state. This is different from the other 47 of the 48 contiguous states in the United States, and it means that, yes, for once, we can absolutely say with confidence Texas is exceptional. Our grid is also exceptional because a significant portion of the power generation is accomplished using new types of technologies, wind power, solar power, and we have a growing fleet of batteries to provide backup. So that means that in Texas, we actually have a pretty high level of integration of inverter-based resources. And to date, these have been designed and programmed to be grid-following resources, meaning they respond to what's happening on the grid and turn the solar or wind power on or off in response to the signals they're getting from the grid. We've already had some problems here. There were some events, they're called the Odessa events, a couple of years ago, where solar farms suddenly disappeared from the grid because somewhere else on the grid there was a power line problem, and the inverters said, oops, there's a problem. We got to turn off these solar panels, and that power was withdrawn from the grid. Fortunately, it didn't result in any power outages, but it was a signal that Texas has to take the lead in addressing the problem. And so the state's grid operator, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT, has already been modeling how to change these electronic devices to prevent that from happening in the future. The events that took place on the Iberian Peninsula are stunning, a little bit scary, and also still not fully understood. And I think we'll learn a lot from the examination of those events about what we need to do here to make sure we don't see the same thing happen in Texas.
Yeah, with regard to the Iberian Peninsula, there have been some preliminary assessments released, much like our colleague Raul Bajo actually leaned into in a brief he wrote just following that event. He's, of course, based at University of Navarra in Spain. He said this will become political, and it certainly has. But and that's unfortunate because in reality, physics is not political, and that's really what we're talking about. Physics is a binding constraint. And one of the things that I'll comment on with regard to Texas, and I'll ask you to lean into this a little bit, we have a significant generation fleet that is very diverse, a lot of spinning resources. And those spinning resources provide an inertial service to the grid that really helps modulate frequency, which is really at the core of maintaining reliability on the system. I wonder if you could comment a little bit on how, particularly because you've studied the history of the Texas grid, how it's evolved over time, including how it's evolved from a regulatory perspective, because I think a lot of people don't really fully understand, for example, why ERCOT is not connected to the rest of the country, but then how that plays into how regulators and market operators have approached reliability and sort of standardization of service across the ERCOT market.
So the history of electrification in Texas is pretty similar to the rest of the country in certain ways. That is that there were municipalities and small companies that built local systems. They served small areas. Usually it was the wealthiest potential customers who bought power first. They were early street lighting systems. And over time, the various companies found it beneficial to connect with each other to share power, sometimes so they could have a backup system when they needed to take their own generators out of service, other times because it was cheaper to buy power from a neighboring company than to build a new generator for themselves. And they connected both within Texas and across state lines. Now, during these early years, and we're talking about the 1890s, early 1900s, there was literally no regulation in Texas. There was no federal entity that was regulating power systems in the country in that way, and Texas did not have a public utility commission regulating electric power companies. Just a side note, by 1920, 44 states did have public utility commissions of one sort or another regulating power companies. In Texas, our utility commission took over that job in 1975. So Texas is quite different from other states in that way. The federal government stepped in a big way in the 1930s, creating responsibilities for the Federal Power Commission that had to do with interstate transfers of power. And at that time, a number of Texas utilities elected to contain their operations within the state rather than falling under this federal regulatory oversight for their wholesale power sales. This changed a little bit during World War II because we needed lots of electricity to produce things like airplanes to fight our battles overseas. And the Federal Power Commission actually ordered various utilities in Texas to interconnect with utilities in neighboring states in order to provide that power. And of course, the Texas companies were patriotic and happy to do that. The legacy of those interconnections is not that we stayed interconnected with Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana, but instead that we ended up with an intrastate interconnected system, which was formalized in the 1960s. And this intrastate system has operated for those many decades, keeping things under control within Texas in a way that is unique in the country. This was further formalized with the creation of the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, which took over operation of what we now call the Texas grid. So it's a very unique system in the sense that it's isolated, but it's also regulatorily unique in that we came to the game so much later than other states in the country.
So the history of the grid and how it's evolved in Texas is unique in many ways. And it's very much a story about large utilities ultimately determining their own fate with regard to how they connect both intrastate, but whether or not they wanted to connect outside of the state. Because, as you mentioned, ERCOT is 90% of the Texas population or Texas demand. But there are utilities, for example, in East Texas that interconnect into Louisiana that are not part of ERCOT. So a really interesting part of that whole dialogue is effectively not that regulators dictated how that evolved. It was really about how private industry actors dictated how that evolved. And I raise this because when we think about how regulators can step in and provide services that increase resilience on a grid, that is a complicating factor. We have to understand history so we understand how things evolved originally, so we understand the position that different entities within the state currently have with regard to interconnecting both with neighbors outside of state boundaries, but also inside of state boundaries. There's been a lot of discussion in this recent legislative session about upgrading and expanding transmission infrastructure in Texas, really on the basis of trying to provide more power, more equitably in a market sense across the entire state. But it opens the door, I think, for a deeper conversation about what's coming next. Because as you referenced, a lot of wind, a lot of solar, a lot of batteries. We still had a lot of natural gas. Texas still has the largest coal fleet in the country. A lot of everything. There's nuclear power. As you sort of look at history and sort of think about how Texas and its grid has evolved, and you think about the projected demands for power, the projected supplies for power from different generating sources, what is at top of mind with regard to how regulators and policymakers can approach the Texas grid and its evolution going forward to ensure reliability and resilience to all of its customers?
There are probably 3 or 4 issues that are top of mind. The first has to do with long-range planning and coordinating across legislative and regulatory entities, because, as you point out, the utilities in Texas have, to a large extent, defined the system that we have today. Those utilities don't exist anymore in the form that they existed in the past, but we do have large power providers. We have owners of transmission networks. We have some still municipal power companies that provide service in, say, Austin and San Antonio. We have rural cooperatives. We have all types of independent power generators. And those are a lot of entities that are answering to different audiences with a common regulator only over certain aspects of their business. And so coordination between the legislature that kind of sets out the outside boundaries of what's going to happen, the regulator, which is the Public Utility Commission of Texas, and the grid operator, which is the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, across all of their obligations and across these different entities to develop plans that will allow for a continued all of the above generation environment. As much as I love the idea of non-polluting power generation, I think that practically we need to have continued reliance on natural gas, potentially in the long run, nuclear power. We need to have continued growth of the solar and wind facilities that are here. We may or may not need continued reliance on coal. We've seen that displaced by natural gas over the years. So we need an all-of-the-above opportunity. We need firm plans about where transmission will benefit this wide array of generators and the customers. And we need coordinated market structures that support the development of those facilities. Secondly, we need research. And this is not necessarily a Texas-only responsibility because the problems that we will address in Texas will be reflected on power grids across the nation. They often look towards Texas to understand how to define markets, how to deal with new technologies, how to integrate renewables, and we need some research dollars to help us understand how to make that work efficiently and effectively. I think we need education for the customers because over time, everybody from the homeowner with the rooftop solar panels and a battery in the garage to the new data center that builds its own power generating facility and storage bank, these are all new participants in the grid in a new way because they're no longer just purchasing power from the grid. They're also potentially selling power to the grid. And I think across the board, these stakeholders will benefit from better understanding of the issues at stake and the challenges ahead. And I guess finally, within Texas and across regulatory bodies, there's a very specific challenge. It's somewhat unique to Texas because we have such a large natural gas fleet and an intrastate natural gas network, but it's also has valence in the rest of the country where natural gas is used heavily for other purposes beyond just powering generation facilities. And that is greater coordination between the regulatory bodies that address these entirely separate yet thoroughly entangled energy systems. And that, I would say, would be the fourth issue on the table. I know that some of that coordination is underway, but I think more is needed. The only other point was what I found such a satisfying factoid that had to do with why are all these weather situations so challenging and what do they mean for the grid in the future, is that long-range planning is completely out the window these days because long-range forecasts are completely out the window. And NERC came out with their 10-year forecast for demand in 2024 and then a year later increased it by 60 to 65%. It's like, how do you make plans with that kind of, for 10 years out when the investment planning is on the long range. Finally, there's the question of resilience. So all of the comments I've made have really addressed what we think of as the bulk power system, which is the generating facilities, the giant transmission lines you see when you drive down the highway, and the transformers that change the voltage as it's moving toward customers. But within each part of the state, there's a distribution network. And this is really where most of the power outages occur. High winds, bad storms, super cold days, super hot days change what's happening on these distribution lines. And, the tree branch falls on the power line in my backyard and I'm without power for a day or two. And the changes that we need there often have to do with modernizing and upgrading those distribution networks. And that takes money, and that requires buy-in from local communities to pay for those improvements. And that's a whole separate set of challenges, but very pressing challenges because of the kinds of weather we experience in the state.
Absolutely. I'm glad you reached into the resilience angle because that's where I want to take the conversation now. You referenced an all of the above approach. Really what that means is, and you leaned into this as well, economics matter, right? Ultimately, we want to provide reliable service 24/7. As you referenced earlier in the conversation, when the consumer flips the switch, the power needs to be there. That requires tremendous amounts of coordination, logistics, supply chain management, all these things that ultimately ensure the electron arrives when it's needed. It's a very, very complicated engineering and logistics problem, without a doubt. But part of that discussion when we think about economics is risk. And the ability to do research so that you can fully quantify and perform risk assessment is really fundamental to this conversation. That, of course, brings me to Miaomiao. Miaomiao Rimmer, of course, is a research manager here at CES, and she's done the yeoman's share of work on developing the dashboard that is now available on our website. Miaomiao, just thinking about this conversation and about resilience in general, I wonder if you could just briefly open the dialogue by just telling us, what does the dashboard help us to visualize?
Thank you for having me. This tool allows users to visualize changes in urban tracts and population density from the 1950s to the present and see how those changes overlay with disasters like hurricane, tornado, and wildfires. Users can explore different temporal combinations of demographics and disasters to compare impacts over time. For instance, first, users can set the hurricane tracks to be from 2011 to 2020, and then change the urban tracks and population density to 1950. And then later, you can change the two layers to 2020. Users can clearly visualize that same hurricane events would cause more damage in later years than 70 years ago, simply because urbanization and population growth. To offer a more holistic view, we also incorporate infrastructure layers such as power lines, power plants, refineries, and gas processing facilities.
That's really interesting. I mean, I think the simplest point here is we've seen significant population growth and expansion of urban tracts in places all over the country, but the Gulf Coast, in particular from Texas all the way to Florida, has experienced just massive growth in both of these dimensions, and it continues today. And I think from the risk assessment perspective, one of the things this highlights is that the risks we are exposed to today from the same storms that hit 75 years ago are quite different today simply because of that. I wonder if you could sort of elaborate a little bit on this, because when you think about what the dashboard indicates, namely you track through time and you look at hurricane tracks, from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, you see there's not a lot of variation. And you also see that the same regions continually are hit, which is not surprising. Florida is a peninsula that sits out in between the Atlantic and the U.S. Gulf, and it is a magnet, if you will, for tropical storms and cyclones. So it's not surprising that it gets hit frequently, but people continue to move there. So I wonder if you could reflect on that a little bit and think about how that could impact potentially how cities and planners ultimately think about risk.
You're absolutely right. As the dashboard reviews, while the overall frequency of the disasters may not have increased, the rising concentration of people and development in high-risk areas, such as coastal zones, wildfire-prone regions, and tornado corridors, has significantly amplified the potential impacts. The shift means cities and planners need to integrate hazard data with trends in population growth and infrastructure development to guide zoning decisions, building codes, and long-term resilience planning.
So just to get a little more specific, because I know you have thoughts on this, how can the dashboard be used to prioritize resilience funding or infrastructure planning efforts?
The dashboard can serve as a powerful tool to prioritizing resilience funding and infrastructure planning by clearly identify where population, critical infrastructure, and natural hazards intersect over time. decision makers can pinpoint areas that are highly exposed and allocate resources more strategically. They can allow a focus on the area where investments in infrastructure upgrades, wildfire mitigation, or emergency services will have the greatest impact.
So I'm glad you just referenced that, because one of the things we saw just after last summer here in Texas, we had the derecho, which sort of caught everybody by surprise. It's not the first time a derecho has actually moved through Texas or even the Gulf Coast region, but they don't happen every year, so it's a surprise, and it actually led to some damage. Made us all remember how important it is to trim our trees, particularly because a lot of the damage was related to trees falling on power lines, which is what Julie referred to earlier. And it also triggered a response from local utilities, the distribution utilities, to think about how they ultimately manage damages, but also manage their network, which is a really interesting development on the heels of that. And then not much after the derecho, we had Hurricane Beryl roll through. The eye of the storm actually went right over my house, which is out in West Houston. But that was interesting because the winds came from the opposite direction. So a lot of the damage that was done to trees when the derecho hit, you got to see the reverse impact of that, if you will, when Beryl hit, because you might have had the north side of trees trimmed, but the south side wasn't necessarily trimmed until Beryl came through. But it was a wake-up call for the region, in particular, how we manage disasters, how we actually develop more resilient infrastructures. One of the things, for example, that CenterPoint locally has done is think about how it segments the grid so that it can actually provide power into neighborhoods in multiple ways. And that helps it identify areas of most extreme damage more rapidly because they can bring other customers back online. So it's an example of where a tool like this, I think, could provide potentially very important insights into how we approach these things. So I wonder if you could, think about that from the standpoint of how, this tool could encourage more collaboration to assess and mitigate risk. So it leans back into the research discussion that we had just a minute ago through planning, emergency management, and local government action.
Yes, this tool can act as a common platform that brings together stakeholders from emergency planning, emergency management, and local governments by offering a shared data-driven view of risk. For example, emergency planners can identify where critical facilities face wildfire or storm exposure, while emergency managers can use the same data to shape evacuation routes. Local government can also align zoning, land use policies, and resiliency investment with these insights.
That's I actually truly hope, and I can tell you, since we've rolled this out earlier this week, there's been a lot of positive response because it's been eye-opening, and it ranges from people who are a little bit older, who remember things like Hurricane Carla when it came through, decades ago, and realizing how much more damaging that potential storm could have been given the current urban tracts and urban expansion and population densities that we see in Texas versus what we saw back then. So it is eye-opening. I encourage everybody to look at it. And it's also incredibly important to internalize the insights that you can gain from these, not only for policymakers and regulators, but also for the general public, because we can do things as well. I mentioned trimming trees. Hopefully everybody has taken that to heart, particularly after what we saw last year. But every little thing that we can do helps. And this tool, I think, is a powerful reminder of how important those things are becoming, because infrastructure resilience, particularly across the energy domain, but everything really, is vital for our economic health and well-being. So as we think about disaster planning, resilience, infrastructure development, the reliability of electrical grids, all of these things intersect in just significant ways. And of course, we are in hurricane season now in the Gulf Coast, so hopefully this is at top of mind, and hopefully this episode will give everybody a lot to think about. So, Julie, do you have anything you want to add before we close?
The tool you've described, Miaomiao, is exactly the kind of thing that will facilitate the kind of coordination needed across, as you say, multiple stakeholders, both locally and potentially statewide. And I've had a glimpse of your tool, and I have to say it's also just really fun to look at it and understand how weather patterns and personal experiences during a crisis like a hurricane intersect, and where the infrastructure is that allows us to either ride it through or not. And hopefully it will help us ride through a lot more in the future.
Thank you, Julie, for the nice comment. It was really fun to create this tool. And if you have any questions, please contact me at mr66@rice.edu.
I want to thank both of you for joining me today. And as always, if anybody has any questions about anything we talked about or about this tool, feel free to reach out and we're happy to answer them. Thank you for tuning in to the Energy Forum. Subscribe and follow our podcast and the Center for Energy Studies for more expert insights on global energy trends. This episode was produced by Maram Hajazi. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Until next time, I'm Ken Medlock.